Welcome to Being Patient Brain Talks. I'm Deborah Kahn, founder of Being Patient. Today, we're going to go talk more on the brain health side, and it's mainly because as a mom, I see changes within my own children related to screen time. So it got us thinking about how much do we know about using our devices and how much time we're on social media, these things, and how that relates to brain development. So joining us today is John Hutton, and he is a researcher who actually has been studying this in young children for a bit of time. So we're coming to him for a little bit of insight. So welcome, John. It's great to see you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Deborah. Thanks for inviting me.
So tell me first, now I believe your research is really in very young children, like 3 to 5. Is that the area you've studied?
Yeah, preschool age has definitely been my wheelhouse. I mean, I've done some work in kids as young as infants and even prenatal, but 3 to 5 is where I've done all my brain imaging work, specifically.
Okay, and I go back to when I get as a mom of 3 kids, because you think 3 to 5, like how much are they on this? I mean, the cartoons in front of the TV, yes, but then I think, I was a little bit guilty of putting my phone and entertaining them when they were acting up in front of them. So, talk to me a little bit about how that early exposure, what's happening in the 3 to 5 year old preschool age. Are we increasing our kids the amount of screen time that they're on?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's really exploded over the past 20 years. I mean, I've heard the sort of evolution of screen time with young children as a great uncontrolled experiment where we've really fundamentally changed how kids are experiencing the world starting in infancy and are just expecting only good things to happen or not sure what's going to happen. And it's just the technology has gone so fast compared to the research. But we know for sure that despite American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations, which are to keep kids off of screens until about a year and a half, infants, as young as 6 months or even younger, are being first exposed to TV. And then tablets and other devices have really changed everything in terms of the older kids because they're getting them at younger ages and being handed a parent's phone. And really the media is following them around in ways that it never did when we were kids.
So it's hard to think about 6 months. So 6 months would be just like a baby, maybe in a seat, and the mom turns on or dad turns on the TV just to keep them entertained while they're doing something else, right?
Exactly.
But 3 to 5, now you're able to kind of grab your mom's phone or dad's phone and play around with it, right? So, what do we know in terms of usage? Is like in terms of your research, do we know like hours like kids are being exposed to per day, especially at that very young age? What's the data out there?
Well, I mean, it's really hard because I mean, a lot of the data has really been dependent on parent report. So parents tend to underreport how much screen time their kids have, and they are trying to come up with more objective measures. And phones can sometimes track, how much app use kids are having, for example. But recent surveys have estimated, the youngest kids anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half, and then really just increasing steadily all throughout childhood to teenagers who are on their devices for 8 hours, 10 hours per day, really just almost more time or generally more time than they're sleeping. So for young kids, it's really exploded to, I would guesstimate, between the 2 and 3 hours in the preschool age range.
So, with those young kids, what has your research discovered? What parts of the brains are you studying? What does happen? I mean, we all probably are impacting our brains by spending so much time, right? Even in front of your laptop. Are there different types of screens that maybe or interactions that are better than others? I mean, we all read our news on the internet now. So, talk to me a little bit about that. Is there when you're doing your research, do you divide up what types of things people are watching, or is it just any screen you're on?
Well, it sort of depends. I mean, sort of backing up a little bit. There's a maxim in brain science: neurons that fire together wire together. So really, whatever a child is doing, starting in infancy, whatever behavior, whether it's language or playing with toys or watching TV, it's going to reinforce the brain circuits that are involved with processing that. We know that 0 to 5 is when the brain's growing most rapidly. It's an extremely dynamic period of early brain development. And the brain's fully grown by age 5, but then it continues to mature through early adulthood. Um, So anyway, my research has really drilled down on the 3 to 5, really in part for practical reasons. Just, I've used MRI, both structural and functional, and it's just in order to do that, you have to have kids be able to participate and sit still in the scanner, and that's about the youngest where you can really play games with them and convince them because you can't sedate them or anything. It's not ethical. So we play the statue game, the spaceship game. They come in there and we've had pretty good success, about 80%, 75% of kids finishing a scan, which can be about 30 minutes with different types with different scan types involved. So we go in there generally with hypotheses about which circuits do we think are going to be impacted by different behaviors. A lot of my research early involved literacy. So we were interested in reading. What are the impacts of reading books at home, more interactive reading, different types of books on animated versus illustrated other formats. And the screen part came in as almost a secondary, where we also asked the parents, who were in the reading research, questions about their child's media use. And those data sets really informed the analyses where we looked at, we did whole brain analyses, looking at what are the impacts on the whole brain, and then specific brain networks, like involved with language or literacy or visual processing.
So when you say you compared, does that mean for kids who are reading just regular books versus on a screen, or is it just people reading books? What is the impact of screen time on the actual literacy level?
Yeah, so we've done a little bit of both. I mean, there's definitely been some debate on the impact of screen time on literacy skills. I mean, we know that there are effects on language skills, particularly expressive language, just more passive viewing, passive use. It's probably the most likely is that screen time tends to displace the reading experience. There's only so many hours in the day, and if the child's on a device or watching TV or whatever, and then they're going to have less time to read with their parents or other caregivers. The amount of reading that's reported at home has really been about the same for the past 30 years. It's like pretty low, about 15 minutes per day, at best in that early childhood, whereas the screen use has gone up into the multiple hours per day. So there's the displacement of reading, but then there also are thoughts about direct impacts of different types of media use on the brain and brain networks. So specifically like fast moving content that's hyper stimulating, violent content that activates parts of the brain involved with fight or flight, and just one in particular more recent is these fast moving videos, these rapid scrolling, that are more kind of dopamine stimulating, where it's just instead of watching a whole movie, they're watching a 30-second clip, one after another, and it's just more of a quick fix.
So like the TikTok, Instagram, I mean, and all kids are on that constantly today, like
Yeah,
that quick change the topic like that, right? And
right.
so that's interesting. I want to parse that out a little bit because I think that's really interesting because it's actually a phenomenon that we are all experiencing today. We all kind of just go from one topic to another. It's like the ADD generation, right? That we're like changing from topic to topic to topic. Do we know how that impacts a developing brain? Really like jumping from topics in a matter of seconds. It's not even minutes, really. It's probably under 30 seconds, right? And you're on to the next
Yeah.
thing. Um, what do we know about that?
Well, so unfortunately, there's not a lot of brain imaging research out there at young ages. I mean, it's just, and a lot of this has to do with just the nature of research. It takes a while to plan a study, to get it funded, to launch it, to get enough participants, and then that can be 5 to 7 years. And by that time, everything's changed in technology. Like think of how quickly AI came on and how VR came on and all this other stuff. So there just hasn't been a lot. Also, like technical challenges where it's just hard to do, particularly MRI on younger kids. But so, like backing up a little bit to my own research, so we've published several studies that specifically look at digital media use or screen time on measures of early brain development. Probably the highest profile involved a study that was structural in nature that was looking at white matter development. And it was published in JAMA in 2000. And what we found there was, and the measure we used was a composite. It was called the screen Q. and it's a 16-item measure that involves four domains of use that are all considered important under American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines. Access to screens, such as screen in the bedroom, frequency of use, hours per day, for example, content, educational or not, for example, and co-viewing, whether or not the parent's using with the child. Higher scores would reflect more or greater non-adherence with the guidelines, things that are likely to be harmful. And what we found in our white matter study was, and it's called diffusion tensor imaging, is that type of study, was that higher scores on the screen Q or greater non-adherence with guidelines was associated with lower measures of white matter maturation, myelination, really all over the place in different fiber tracks, but most specifically in ones related to language and literacy skills, executive function. We also administered measures, cognitive measures at the same time, and when the kids with lower measures of white matter development also had lower vocabulary skills, lower phonological skills, lower measures of executive function, and lower overall early literacy skills. And this was controlled for age, sex, and household income.
When did you complete this research? I'm just wondering the years that you were studying this.
So the study itself was conducted in the 2000 teens, the late 2000 teens, like 17 through 20, and the publication came out in 20.
Okay, good. So you're pre-COVID, right? Because I know that
Yeah, it was
there's some
pre-COVID.
studies out there, the impact of masking kids for so long had a lot of impact on developmental for that age, right? But so
Right.
this is data before the pandemic came into play.
Yes. And it
So
was, yeah.
just to be clear about white matter versus gray matter, can you give us a little bit of insight and define like what is white matter versus gray matter? That's what we hear, those two terms in the brain, and what does that mean for development?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it really comes down to what they look like on MRI, for example. So the gray is the surface of the brain. It's really the cells, the cell bodies, and it's a very thin surface on the cortex, or thin area called the cortex, which is like the skin of an apple, basically. It's where all the synapses form for the most part on the surface of the brain. There are deeper synapses, but the ones on the cortex are involved with sort of higher order skills like language and vision and other things. So that's the gray matter, is the cell bodies. And then the white matter is really the wires that connect all the cells to one another and allow them to form networks. And the reason it's white is it's coated in a fatty substance called myelin, which is sort of like the rubber on a wire in your house. It insulates the fiber tracks and makes them faster and more efficient. And white matter develops really in direct proportion to how much it's used. So how much those tracks are reinforced. So if you're talking more, than your white matter tracks involved with language are gonna get thicker and more myelinated and more efficient. And then gray matter, by contrast, the maturation of gray matter is more complicated. It follows a whole different sort of developmental pathway. But I'll stop talking and I can explain that if you want, if you'd like.
Yeah, so okay, so what you were seeing is less white matter in the children 3 to 5 who had more screen time. How much are we talking about? I'm sure as like a lot of parents are out there going like, but how much? Is it like an hour a day? Is it 5 hours a day? What was the time?
And that was that's the I think the really interesting thing about the measure we used, because a lot of screen time research has involved one question, like how many hours per day does your child watch TV, for example. A lot of the early screen time research was TV. And the problem with that is that it's hard for parents to say, well, is it for school? What kinds of shows are we talking about? What time was it? And so it's not a very nuanced type of question. And the Screen Cube, by contrast, was really developed for a particular reason, to incorporate different aspects of screen use that could potentially have an impact. So, for example, access to screens. We know that kids with a screen in their bedrooms, for example, tend to watch more. They're more unsupervised. It tends to interfere with their sleep. It's related to all kinds of negative outcomes like obesity, attention problems, poor sleep. And then content, for example, there are all different types of content. Some called educational is not really educational. Some's educational and it actually is educational. But we asked that question: is it more for entertainment or education? So the fact that it was a composite measure was it's supposed to just convey like overall this household and this child was exposed to more sort of screen practices or limits that are linked to negative
So
potentially.
it wasn't a matter of minutes or hours that you were comparing, really. It's more like how much in their lives are these well, I mean, I guess it adds up to more time, but
I mean,
um,
and there was variability in the amount of hours per day, so anywhere from half an hour to over 5 hours in some of these families. But the thing about that is that could be 5 hours of Sesame Street, or it could be, 1 hour that's at 2 a.m., which could be, so all these different questions are intended to have more nuanced.
that's actually a question that just came through from one of our viewers saying, is there a difference? What if they're watching educational programming? I mean, we know for a fact schools use now a lot of video, right? And so does that is that bad for us or is that bad for the kids to actually be learning on the screen versus, learning on pen to paper or on a book? And is it even if they're learning insights from or new knowledge from a screen, is that not as good as learning from a piece of paper? Do we know
So,
that?
well, it was a really important concept in pediatrics, and I'm a pediatrician by training, and it's that children are not small grown-ups. And really, how they learn changes with their age very dramatically. So, infants, for example, are really just learning how the real world works, and they are sights and sounds and touch, and really, it's all about their senses. And there's some good, really interesting research showing that they really don't learn well at all through screens. They just don't understand it yet. It's called the video deficit. And older kids, there's not a ton of evidence that screens really are effective, particularly with young kids. I mean, that research really hasn't been done, even though screens just exploded into classrooms during COVID and have been very convenient and very, um, you know, I don't know, efficient ways to teach. But I hear a lot from parents that certain kids just don't learn well that way. They need a more in-person thing. They do better when they write things down with a pencil. There's probably a lot of variability in how kids learn. The thing about educational though with media, for example, apps and programs, is it's sort of like natural food. The term educational is thrown on all kinds of products for kids, but there's not really a standard in the U.S. for to really prove that that's true. Not a lot of companies research their products. Sesame Workshop is one example of one that does. Same with the PBS Kids, for example. They tend to have educational psychologists and other on their development teams, but a lot of the stuff out there just hasn't been tested at all, and it's um, but parents see the educational term on it, they're like, oh, well, that must be good for my child. And that's actually a big driver of use of screens is the idea that if a child's on an educational thing, then just let them sit there and watch all day and they're going to be learning. But that might not be true.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So, from that 3 to 5 age group, you concluded that more screen time actually led to a slowdown in both the growth of white matter in the brain as well as developmental literacy, whether it's vocabulary or reading. Is that correct? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that was right. And we did one other study where we looked at gray matter. And so the white matter was a little easier to explain, just less use of these different circuits, whether that's from displaced reading or less playtime with toys or whatever it was, and also lower skills. But we did another study where we looked at gray matter development, and we found that similarly with kids with higher screen use scores had thinner areas of cortex of their brain in a couple of different places. One was in visual areas, which was attributed to just greater efficiency of that part of the brain. It's supposed to be thinning faster, but also thinner in areas of the brain that are involved with what we call higher order skills, particularly social cognition and
So,
empathy.
reasoning or
More like empathy, more like,
empathy.
social cognition, understanding what others are thinking and feeling. And that was a concerning finding in the sense that that area of the brain should be thickening at that age rather than thinner. And we also had some areas that were involved with literacy that were thinner that you'd think would be thicker as well. So, and that actually lines up with some research in adolescence where they found sort of thinner cortex in similar parts of the brain related to social cognition skills. And anyway.
I think a lot of parents probably hearing this are starting to panic, including myself, mom of 3 kids. And I was saying to you earlier that, I've noticed a big difference in terms of screen usage from my older daughter versus my younger daughter. There's 5 years between them, and the technology just really ramped up. You had Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, all these other apps that my older daughter didn't have during those kind of prime teenage developmental years. I'm seeing in among my youngest daughter and her peers just huge amounts of anxiety um, that you can't help but think, is this because they're on all these apps and everyone thinks their world is so much better than because it looks perfect so what do we know about really the impact of screen time? Like I know you've studied really early childhood, but what do we know in those key crucial developmental years of teenage? I mean, I know your frontal cortex develops until you're about 25, right? But
Yeah,
there's a big spurt in there in your teenage developmental years, which are really very key formative years into adulthood. So
for sure.
what do we know? Where is the research on this? I mean, I know you're not studying it currently at University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center yourself, but are you aware of other things, or maybe you're thinking about future studies?
Yeah, there's a very large ongoing longitudinal study called the ABCD study, which involves pre-adolescents and now adolescents that specifically is looking at mental health as one of its primary outcomes. And they've released a couple of papers based on that cohort where they found a bunch of things, but one was the kind of differences in cortical thickness related to screen use. And that lines up with what we found, and also greater sort of, they call it externalizing behaviors, greater manifestations of anxiety and sort of acting out in these early adolescents. Later on, they're interested in looking at what you just said, incidents of anxiety, depression, more clinical things. We know that those diagnoses are on the rise dramatically over the past 10 years for sure. And there's definitely a connection with more social media where kids that are predisposed to being anxious or are predisposed to more more aggressive behaviors, whatever. If they get on tons of screen time that reinforces that, it's going to make them worse. It's going to make their whatever they've got worse. And it is a big concern. So it's really the two age ranges that I worry about are the 0 to 5 when the brain's growing really rapidly, and then the adolescence, the puberty when the brain's growing really rapidly. And the first case, kids are trying to understand the real world. Secondly, they're trying to figure out where they fit in the real world. How are they okay? Are they, and then now they're all of a sudden they're comparing themselves to everyone all over the world and saying, well, I'm not having nearly as much fun as all these other people. And they're not allowed to be vulnerable. They're not allowed to be, it's just they have to sort of stay in this ball of perfection, and it's very hard.
It's incredibly hard. I guess one critical question I have is, can you get like the thinning and the like not the white matter in the brain that's not developing as quickly? Can you get it back? I mean, is the impact a long-term impact, or if you reduce the screen time, does it recover? Does your learning speed up? Like what happened? What do we know about that?
Well, we definitely know that the brain is very plastic throughout our life, and that's changed a lot in research on adults, where they thought, well, by the time you're in your 60s, your brain is pretty much set, and there's nothing you can do about it. But thinking about, research with people that have had strokes and people that have had accidents, I mean, the brain has a remarkable ability to recover from all kinds of things. But the key is making significant changes. So if this is a child who becomes addicted to playing video games and they won't come out of their bedroom, and you worry about their ability to self-regulate and interact with other kids, if you make the dramatic change and somehow get them off of that and really, I mean, they have to do some rehab really, and just kind of get back into the real world and rewire their circuits. It's definitely possible, and it's definitely never too late. It's just a matter of really making significant changes in their lifestyle, especially with things that are giving them that are related to sort of negative consequences. So
And
um,
what is your next realm of study, John, at University of Texas in Southwestern Medical? Are you continuing these studies? Are you going to the next phase? What's next?
yeah, we're really interested in conducting some longitudinal research looking at a number of different outcomes. And again, I tend to anchor to 3 to 5. That's just my people. But we're looking at not just literacy, but math skills, social skills, executive function, in a more longitudinal way, like starting at age 3 and then following through kindergarten. So we want to do more longitudinal studies because the first studies we published have been cross-sectional, where we're looking at how do these kids look right now, but it's hard to know if any, and, what the cause was, or what things were really directly causing those things. There's definitely a high correlation, but we want to do longitudinal studies looking at more types of outcomes. The other area that I'm really interested in, and this kind of is back to what you're saying about kids who are vulnerable, is there's a really important concept in the digital media research called differential susceptibility, which is the idea that not all kids are going to have the same impacts from screen use. If you have a room full of 100 and they all watch the same amount of screen time, 20% will benefit. They'll FaceTime with their grandparents, they'll write a report for school, it'll be wonderful. 60% it'll be a mixed bag. They'll get their homework done, but a little distracted. They'll go outside. They'll not sleep quite as well, but for the most part, they're doing okay. And then 20% will really crash. They're the ones that are going to be terribly anxious. They're going to get hooked on their screens. And it tends to fall into categories of kids that are more distractible, more risk-taking, more anxious by nature. And yeah, and so it's really important. It's very similar to any health condition. Like risk for cancer, heart disease, whatever it is. There's probably this certain kids are wired to be to really struggle more. And yeah, and
I mean, we kind of saw that during COVID, right? Some kids
sure.
could handle the learning over the screen, and other kids, it just did not work at all, right? So.
Right, and it's gonna so it really just begs the question of in the U.S. should we be more careful with all kids and restrict more until we know things are safe, or should we just let things roll and see what happens? Like what
Okay,
kinds of restrictions are appropriate?
before we go, I have to ask you this question. I didn't ask you if you have your own children, but if you don't, or if you do, what would be the rules in your house for knowing what you know? What would you say about, what would be your rules?
Yeah, so one of my taglines is screen free until 3. So first of all, like I really love the idea, and we try with our kids. I have 3 daughters, and they're much older, 31, 27, and 19. And the 31-year-old looks at the 19-year-old like, like she's an old lady looking at a young kid. She's like, back in my day, we didn't have tablets, whatever. And it's really funny seeing how much just things have changed. But yeah, screen free until 3 is one. The longer you can keep kids off the screens and get them anchored in the real world, I think the better. As far as specific behaviors, I used to be more of an hours limit person, but now both with my own kids and with my patients, I focus on context of use. Like, what are the situations in your own home where it's okay to use screens and which ones is not? So mealtime, for example, let's try to put them away. Bedtime is another, like screens in the bedroom. If the more you can keep them out, especially for younger kids, the better. We know they tend to use more and have more oversight. Short car trips, for example, just let kids chill out a little bit and get a little bit bored and daydream a little bit. So I think those are some contextual things that I think can make a big difference. And then parents looking at their own screen use because kids are watching you, and if you're on your phone at the park and whatever, they're going to say, well, park's not as fun as the phone, so let's use a phone instead. And yeah, as much as possible to stay engaged with the child, especially younger ones, and put your own phone away. Give yourself a break too.
100%. And I was going to say that's so valuable. I mean, all of us as parents are guilty of it, right? So
Yes.
it's just being mindful of it, right? Put it away. Talk to your kid. Don't worry, and the email can wait. So, thank you so much, John. I find this fascinating, and as a mom too, incredibly useful. Please keep us abreast of your future research. I think it's something everybody should know about. I'm so glad that you're studying it. I think we need more research because we're seeing impacts, but we really need to know how we can help brain development and what's the healthiest for us. So thank you so much for what
Sure.
you do.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for what you do as well.
And if you missed any of this interview, don't forget we put it on beingpatient.com. Sign up for our newsletter. That's where we tell you about these interviews. Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. See
Uh,
you later, Deborah.
all right. Sorry.